Welcome. In this unit, we're going to be studying women in the Bible, and we're going to try to look at some passages from the Old Testament and the New Testament to get kind of a broader idea of how women were represented in biblical times. Just a heads up, so the Bible is, and Christianity and Judaism at large, are considered to be patriarchal in nature, which simply means that the gods and any deities worshipped are male. All of the holy books are written by men, and most of the practitioners of the faith, meaning priests, pastors, and so forth, are male. So we consider this religion and the holy book to be patriarchal in nature as opposed to matriarchal. So that may account for some of the representations of women that we see here. Before we dig into maybe some of the negative representations, I did want to take a moment to focus on the positives. So we do have a few women in the Bible who we might consider to be heroines. First, we have Esther. Esther gets her own book in the Bible. It's one of the shortest books in the Bible, and oddly is the only book that does not mention God's name. So why it was included in the Bible, you will have to decide. But it is a kind of a harrowing adventure story about this woman, Esther, who breaks the law by speaking directly to the king and stands up for herself and ultimately helps to save the king from an assassin. So really wonderful story about a heroic and brave Jewish woman named Esther. Miriam was Joseph's sister, so she's the one who saved the baby Joseph from the river. And during the 40 years that the Israelites wandered the desert, God blessed Miriam with a kind of portable well, so she was able to basically keep everyone alive because she was able to provide water. Deborah is really an oddly powerful woman in the Bible. She's one of the judges from the book of Judges. And in addition to being a judge, which made her very powerful, she was also a warrior and a prophetess. So kind of an oddly empowered and powerful woman in Deborah. Unfortunately, that's about it. Most of the other women in the Bible are either more passive in nature or are not represented in a powerful light. So we're going to focus on the specific texts that you were asked to read. The first passages that you read were from the book of Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy is a book in the Old Testament, and it is meant to record Moses' sermons to the Israelites after they wander in the desert. And in Deuteronomy, Moses tells the Israelites what God commands in terms of his law. So in terms of God's commands regarding women, Moses tells us in chapter 21 that men can freely choose wives from conquered civilizations. So if the Israelites were to go to war and conquer another village or country, they are welcome to choose a wife, whether or not she consents, I guess, to live with them. And in chapter 21, verse 15, it suggests that men can have multiple brides. So it talks about men having more than one wife and how inheritance is passed to the children that the man has with those wives. So we do have some sort of references to polygamy at that stage in biblical history. In verses 13 through 19, there is a very elaborate system regarding women and their virginity. So what typically would happen was that if a man was married to a woman and he didn't like her or didn't want to be married to her anymore, he would often question her virginity publicly. And this was a great shame to the women and their family because virginity was pretty much the only thing that made a woman have any worth at this stage. And so if her virginity was challenged, her family had to produce her wedding sheet. So they would put a white piece of fabric underneath the woman on the night that she had sex with her husband for the first time, and she was meant to bleed on it when her hymen was broken. And if the family could not produce that sheet, or if for some reason the woman did not bleed, then the man can assert that the woman was not a virgin when she got married, and she would be stoned publicly. In chapter 21, verse 23, There is really verse 23 and 25 kind of go together. So there's this really elaborate law about when you can and cannot rape a woman and who is punished for it. So if a man rapes a woman in town, then both the man and the woman he raped will be put to death. Obviously, the man is put to death because he raped a woman who was engaged to be married to someone else. And the woman is put to death because she was in town with a bunch of people around and she didn't scream for help or didn't scream for help loudly enough. So I suppose the idea is that she wanted it to happen somehow. And so she, in that case, would be killed, stoned. Now, if the man were to rape the woman in the forest or the countryside, meaning there were not a lot of people around, then the woman does not have to die. Only the man has to die because I guess presumably no one could have heard her scream anyway. But these things only apply to women who are engaged. If a man is to rape an unengaged woman, meaning she's not set to be married to someone else, then he really is fine. All he has to do is to pay her father some money, and then he has to marry her. So the woman, in effect, would then be forced to marry her rapist. So we can see here a really, really kind of sexist and patriarchal system in which women have really very little power to protect themselves or to make choices about their own sexuality or sexual partners. Moving forward, we have St. Peter. And so the book of Peter, 1 Peter, is advice from Peter to countries who were suffering religious persecution. And so essentially he's writing letters to these countries, giving them advice on how to live a good Christian life, even under persecution from their governments. So he has a section, a kind of a brief section about particularly how men and women should behave towards each other. In chapter 3, verse 1, Peter points out, of course, that wives should submit to their husbands. So it was widely held, and still is in many Christian denominations, that men are kind of the heads of the household and that women are in a position of submission or subservience to their husbands. So they sort of have to obey. We still have that in a lot of marriage vows, this idea of obedience. It also says that particularly women should be submissive and behave well, particularly so that they can win their husbands to God. And this is a long-standing belief system that women are supposed to be sort of saintly because men's nature is sinful. And so the women are supposed to sort of shepherd their husbands back to good behavior. We talked about the Madonna whore complex early on in the semester in our terminology, and I want you to notice how that shows up in the Bible. So it's either that women are supposed to be these Madonna figures who are completely virtuous, modest, almost sexless, and those Madonna figures sort of save their husbands. Or we have this other depiction of women as the whore. So we have the idea of Eve, who is sinful and able to be tempted, and men are really not supposed to trust these women because they will lead the men astray. So the women either serve as the Madonna figure or the whore figure, but there aren't very many complex women in the Bible that are shown in between. In verse 3, Peter tells us that wives are not supposed to focus on their outward beauty, and this is repeated in other books in the Bible. Women are supposed to dress very modestly, no jewelry, no elaborate hairstyles, no expensive clothes. Men are not given quite such specific direction in terms of their physical appearance, although there are some books in the Bible that talk about how men should wear their facial hair. But women's appearance is highly regulated in the Bible. And again, this relates to that Madonna whore complex. So the women have to be seen as modest and virtuous, lest they be kind of associated with the whore moniker. Finally, in verse 7, we have this verse that says, husbands are called to honor their wives as the weaker partner. So essentially, on the surface, Peter is telling the husbands to be kind to their wives, but the reason that men are supposed to be kind to their wives is because the wives are weaker. And in this, he probably is talking about physically weaker and smaller, but also not as wise, not as decisive. So there's this understanding among the men that the women are almost childlike in their need to be taken care of. This is interesting as you associate verse 1 and verse 7. Verse 1 and verse 7. So in one way, the women are supposed to be virtuous and lead their husbands to God, but nonetheless, the husbands are the stronger partner and the wives are the weaker partner. So there does seem to be some contradiction there. The last material that we're covering is 1 Timothy. So 1 Timothy is a letter from the Apostle Paul to his younger colleague Timothy on how to be a good faith leader. So Paul wrote a lot of letters in the Bible. We call these the epistles of Paul. And in this one, he's giving advice to a young guy on how to live up to being a Christian leader. So in chapter 2, Paul gives Timothy quite a lot of advice about how women should be treated, especially in terms of communities of faith. In verse 8, Paul says that men are not really, or rather, he omits any dress requirements for men. But again, just like the previous book, women are given very specific directions to dress modestly, not elaborately. Again, no jewelry or fancy hairstyles. In verse 11, Paul tells Timothy that women should learn quietly and with full submission. So again, there's this idea that women are not on a position of equal standing with men, and they should learn silently and be very submissive in nature. In verse 12, we have this idea that women are not permitted to teach men or have any position of authority over men. And this verse in particular is one of the verses that leads to our still pervasive idea that preachers, priests, and other church leaders should only be male. This verse is often cited when women are not allowed to be in those kinds of positions of authority. And the reason that Paul gives that women cannot be teachers or in positions of authority is because Eve kind of represents all women. And again, she was more easily deceived, more easily tempted. So women, in Paul's opinion, are kind of weak-willed and not very smart. And so this is why we would never want them in positions of power, because they may, again, be tempted and lead men astray. So because of Eve, I suppose, all women are kind of put into a lower position than men. Paul does sort of generously add that women can make up for this deficiency through childbearing. So this was seen as kind of a punishment and a way to become virtuous. So some kind of difficult things to wrestle with in terms of women in the Bible. So we want to think about how this represents women as thinkers, members of families, and how much empowerment they had at this point, which was, again, not really very much. There were some empowered women in the Bible, but they were really pretty rare. And most women would have been in these situations, which was a situation of submission, modesty, silence, and ultimately kind of being seen as guilty in regards to Eve. If you have any questions, please feel free to send me an email. Thank you.